Hello everyone. If you like this audiobook and want to listen to more, please consider subscribing. And if you like this video, like it as well, that it enjoy.
Ken, a raspy, feminine voice broke the silence, followed by three loud dings that echoed through his bedroom. Ken blinked his eyes awake, wiping them groggily with a lethargic groan. Ken, I need your help. Another three high-pitched rings. He sat up fast, his mattress springs squeaked at the sudden movement. He swung his legs off of his rickety bed, hissing as his feet hit the cold, rotting wooden floor beneath him. He ignored the sensation, quickly pulling a ripped old shirt over his head. On his desk a messy stack of medical letters sat, calling for Ken's attention, but he tried his best to ignore them. Yet his stomach felt impossibly heavy whenever they caught his attention. He shook his head, pulling open his bedroom door with more force than necessary. He saw her sitting by the window in an old rocking chair, two thick blankets laid over her lap as the morning sun poured through the thin windows in gorgeous rivulets. "Sorry," she said, her voice soft and impossibly weak. I just need my medicine." She hung her head in shame, her finger limply hanging over a small bell he'd bought her. Ken sighed, a knot building in his throat as he tore his eyes away from his mother. He rushed to grab a bottle of water from the cabinet. Drinking tap water wasn't wise. Not here. He crushed multiple pills, stirring them into the bottled water. His mother's hand trembled as she reached for the glass. Ken reached out to steady it for her. The doctor said she needed to eat before she took the pills, but he knew she didn't have an appetite. He used to protest, refusing to give her the pills until she ate. But that always ended awfully. Watching his mother tearing up as she forced herself to eat, Ken swallowed, forcing the images out of his head. He couldn't bear it, any of this. "Sorry for waking you, Ken," his mother started to whisper as she sipped on the water, but Ken cut her off. "No, I needed to be up," he said. "I have that study thing today," he tried to reassure her. She gave him a weak smile. She saw straight through his reassurance. Guilt tore Mary up. She'd been sick for years now. Sometimes she just wished she'd succumb to it all. Let her son live a normal life, but then she also couldn't leave Ken on his own. She knew what he was like. Mary glanced up, watching Ken move around in the cramped kitchen, his sleeves rolled up and hair messy from sleep. The steady, familiar sound of the frying pan crackled through the apartment. Tears welled up before she could stop them. She pressed her sleeve to her face, pretending to wipe away sweat. She wished she could make him breakfast again, just once. The smell of toast, the sound of him humming along to his cartoons, the way he used to swing his legs off the kitchen chair and talk about everything he wanted to be when he grew up. It felt like a different lifetime. She remembered how hectic it all used to be. Waking him before sunrise, throwing on her uniform, burning his toast half the time. Dropping him off at school a whole hour early, because she couldn't bear the thought of him walking to school alone. Not in Gotham. She'd go straight to work, long hours that drained all the life out of her. On her break, she'd pick him up and bring him home before having to go right back to work. She hated it, with every fiber of her being. But now she can't even stand and give her son a hug. And she hates that so much more. "I'm heading out," Ken said, as he handed her a small plate of scrambled eggs. He knew she wasn't hungry, but he'd always put the food there, and whenever he came back he'd find at least some of it gone. That was good enough for him. He opened the front door, preparing to get going, but his mother's voice stopped him. "See you later, Ken, I love you," she softly called out. He paused, looking over his shoulder. His mother had her head down, pretending to be moving the blankets. She was ashamed. "I love you too," he said softly. Ken arrived at the study. He was used to these environments now. Sketch buildings filled with even sketchier people. You sold them blood, plasma, or even took some new party drug they planned to mass produce. He eyed the large warehouse, taking a deep breath. He never liked being around these human studies. It just felt dangerous. Too many desperate people. It just fills the room with an uncomfortable tension. He walked through the main entrance, blinking in shock at what he saw. The walls were white, spotless, and the air smelled thickly of disinfectant. This was the kind of clean you only saw in actual hospitals, not sketchy testing centers. For a second he could almost forget where exactly he was, until he saw the two armed guards waiting near the reception. Carefully he approached the receptionist, a white woman with two white teeth and a large smile. He made sure to not get too close. He didn't want to accidentally alert the guards. "Hello, are you here for test 31B?" the woman asked in a chipper tone, Ken hesitated. He wasn't used to this, not even actual hospital workers were this excited. She does realize she doesn't need customer service for this. Yeah, I don't remember the exact name of it, but I've got this. Ken said as he showed her a screenshot off of his phone. It's an email they sent. Before the woman could even look at the form, she nodded and smiled even wider at him. Perfect, she exclaimed as she started typing rapidly on the laptop sitting in front of her. Please take a seat, someone will call on you soon. Again, he hesitated, she didn't even know his name. How were they going to call on him? The waiting area is over there, one of the guards said gruffly, nodding towards a pair of double doors. Ken stood for a moment, hesitation clear on his face. Before he shook his head, he needed this. $300 wasn't the most he'd made from one of these studies, but it was definitely on the higher end. Probably another party drug test, he thought. They'd dose him, take some blood and observe him for a couple hours. Easy money. He turned, striding towards the double doors. The electric hum of the lights disappeared as the thick doors shut with a bang behind him. The room was deathly quiet. He quickly assessed the people waiting, only 3, all oozed desperation but not danger. All their heads hung low, avoiding any eye contact. The air here smelled thick, metallic almost. He was about to sit, but a door flew open, slamming against the wall behind it with a loud crash. Ken's head snapped towards the sound, his fists clenched, his eyes wide and alert. A man in a pristine doctor's coat poked his head out, locking eyes with Ken. His gaze was sharp, but a smile easily lit his face as he gestured towards the teenager. You're next, the man said casually. Ken blinked in surprise, and glanced around the room at the others waiting in case the doctor was actually talking to someone behind him. Come on, we haven't got all day, the doctor laughed as he gestured for Ken to come towards him. Ken swallowed, feeling the eyes of the other people in the waiting room now glued on him. But he walked towards the man, heading through the door. Slowly they made their way down the never-ending hallway. Ken followed behind, eyeing every closed door they passed, trying to get a glimpse of the sort of test he could expect. God, this hallway was cold, he thought to himself. He thought back to his home. He hoped his mother was okay. That was his last thought before a sharp, stinging pain stabbed into his neck. Frantically he turned, eyes wide and vision blurring as he stumbled backwards. A man was standing behind him, empty needle in hand and a sharp assessing look in his eyes. Ken's knees buckled beneath him as a burning sensation spread through his veins. But before he could protest, fight or run, he fell. It felt like a constant blur, like he was trapped halfway between sleep and waking. He couldn't think, couldn't move, could barely breathe. God, he was so hungry. He doesn't even remember where he was, who he is, what led him here. The only constant was the full electric buzzing and the awful, terrible hunger. Sometimes clipped, professional voices cut through his mental fog. RC count is very high, this'll be our first. Ridiculous, we couldn't possibly transport him in. Stabilize him now, or we lose every. He tried to move, twitch his fingers, tense, scream, but nothing ever happened. It felt like he weighed tons, that his own body was crushing him. He'd feel stabbing pains, burning sensations that tore through him like a storm, and awful, invasive, impossibly cold hands that seemed to dig into him and tear everything apart. Why was he so hungry? He wanted to sleep, normally sleep, not whatever this is. He couldn't bear it, he just wanted his mother. Richard walked into the chamber belonging to patient 037. The door hissed shut behind him, sealing in the sterile air. He approached the boy's bedside table, observantly glancing over him. The patient was young, dark black hair, pale skin that reflected the bright ultra-white lights overhead. Richard started with the simple check, noting down his heart rate, his oxygen levels and his RC count. Then he went into the physical, a light press against his ribs, the neck and arms. Everything seemed normal, but he needed to check the boy for everything. His bosses wouldn't accept anything less. He leaned over the boy, checking his face. His thumb hooked gently beneath the eyelid, lifting it to inspect the pupil. He froze. The pupil contracted sharply, as if responding to the hash light from above. The doctor quickly let the eyelid fall shut, frowning as he leaned further forward to check the other eye. Again his thumb hooked underneath the eyelid and lifted it, and once again the doctor froze. But this time for a completely different reason. The iris was blood red. The sclera, a pitch black that seemed to swallow the light around it. For a moment Richard could only stare, transfixed by the sheer wrongness of it. Then instinct kicked in and he jerked his hand back if as burned. But the eyelid didn't close. It stayed wide open. And then it moved. The eye snapped to him, locking on with a wild frantic precision. The pupil shrank to a needle point and Richard's breath hitched as the boy's wild, panicked gaze pinned him in place. The monitors started to beep rapidly, causing a loud, ear-piercing alarm to wail throughout the facility. Red warning lights started to flash. Richard could hear the other doctors and staff start to rush towards the room. The alarm meant something was wrong with a patient, and they couldn't have this fail. 37's the most promising one. The boy's chest rose as a sudden shuddering panicked breath dragged itself up from 37's lungs. It was as if he'd been drowning before. His fingers twitched and he had attempted to move but thick metal restraints held 37 down. 37's eyes darted wildly across the room, wide and alert. He looked as if he wanted to speak, but all that came out of his throat was a hoarse rasping sound, so dry that it seemed to pull all of the moisture out of the air with it. The animalistic sound made Richard take an instinctive step back, the alarm still wailing as fellow doctors poured into the room. They quickly surrounded the experiment, eyes wide as they each individually poked and prodded at 37. Then came the sound, a deep, slow creak. Everyone froze. The restraints around patient 37's were bending. No one moved at first. Then chaos. A few doctors immediately ran towards the door, some panicked and fumbled with their radios, calling for help, and some couldn't help but freeze as they stared at the patient in fear. The creaking turned into a shriek as the restraints tore. Ken stood on cracked pavement, staring up at the familiar outline of his apartment building. His window was dark. He felt a twinge of guilt, his stomach feeling impossibly heavy. She had been there, all alone, all day. His breath came out unevenly, fogging up the freezing air. The air smelt of smog and rust, a refreshing change to the antiseptic that had previously filled his senses. In the distance, a siren wailed, sharp and lonely. The street was empty and he was thankful for that. He just wanted to get home, without any extra hassle. His mother was going to be so worried, she'd never let him back outside, he thought to himself as a small smile lit up his face. Hopefully they had food in. He was glad to be back. He took a single step towards the door, his legs trembling and fingers numb. Relief within touching distance, he just needed to make it up the stairs. Eventually he made it to the door, the familiar sight making a gentle but all too real smile grow on his face. He reached out, the cold metal of the door handle feeling warm. He was home. He pushed the door open with a creak. It smelled like mold and stale air. Why did it smell like mold? But underneath all of that, was something different. Something new. His mouth filled with salvia, his stomach twisting ferally as hunger suddenly clawed at him like it wanted out. He took another step into the apartment, leaving the door wide open. Was his mother cooking? No, she hadn't cooked in years. She couldn't. He took another step, slower this time. Each movement felt like less of his own doing, and more instinctual, like he was being guided by something else. He walked past a photo frame, a picture of him and his mother when he was much younger, a thin layer of dust covering it. "Mum," he called softly, though his voice was coarse. No answer. She was asleep. The floorboards creaked beneath him as he made his way to the living room. The old rocking chair sat by the open window. His mother's form sat still, her back to him, the blankets falling over the armrests. Rivulets of moonlight poured into the dark unlit room, casting an eerie glow through his home. He approached, trying his best to ignore his cramping, growling stomach. Further pushing down his new animalistic urges. She sat there, like she always did, but then he saw an empty pill bottle laid by her feet. He frowned, his gaze shooting to her limp pale arm, hanging loosely off the chair. His hand shook as he reached out, gently touching her cold shoulder. Mum?" he asked, his voice breaking as a horrible, awful suspicion burned bright. He shook her harder. "Mum," he repeated in a weak whisper. He felt weak, but he continued to shake her, though he knew the truth. "Answer me, please," his voice broke. His knees collapsed beneath him, as he buried his head into her cold lap. Painful sobs tore through his body. When did this happen? He felt like he hadn't eaten in years. How long was he gone? A rich, warm smell filled his senses. Did she think he'd abandoned her? Oh God, his hunger tore through him, one of his eyes burning a bright, blood red. Did she do this to herself? The scent now surrounded him, his fists clenched hard. "Stop," he whispered, his voice breaking. His mouth filled with salvia. He looked up, into his mother's dead, glassy eyes. He sobbed. He was so hungry. Please stop, he whined as the hunger roared in victory. Rain. It fell in heavy, cold sheets, from the dark, lightning-filled skies above. It soaked through his thin hospital robe and plastered his dark hair onto his forehead. It filled the dark street with a pattering that drowned out Ken's thoughts and hid the flow of salty tears pouring down his face. But it could not fully wash away the dark, wet blood on his hands and face, nor the metallic taste that burned on his tongue, a taste that would haunt him forever. A tall man wearing a dark outfit stepped carefully through the wreckage, his cape dragging through slick pools of blood that reflected the harsh fluorescent lights above. Bodies laid torn and broken throughout the laboratories, expensive equipment destroyed and scattered. Batman's observant sight swept through the surrounding carnage, noting deep gouges in the walls, the doors that had been torn off their hinges and the trail of corpse following their wake. The detective kneeled near a dead man, the cause of death clear. Brute force, to the extent that the Mont's whole ribcage had caved inwards, destroying his organs and ending his life almost instantaneously. Bruce knew what this building was, it was a lab. They'd made this monster. Blood-stained puddle. In a dark alleyway, Ken hid, his head hanging low as he sat on the hard, wet concrete. The shadows covered the teenager like a blanket from the all-too-loud outside world. He could hear everything, the whispering of two women almost an entire street away, the distant hum of power lines, even the slowly pulsing blood in passing veins. He could see tiny individual dust mites in the air, each one sharp and distinct. He was so wrong. Unnatural. It was freezing, he was wearing torn, dirty clothes that he'd stolen from a thrift store. It had been 2 days since he had. He swallowed, the memory bringing an unimaginable amount of guilt to the surface, even thinking of what he had done, what he did to his own. He wanted to throw up, but he knew he couldn't. His body wouldn't let him. He was too hungry. His jaw clenched at the burning sensation clawing at his stomach. It's time, he told himself as he shakily stood, eyeing the bright entrance of the alleyway. He needed to eat. Slowly, he got to his feet and eyed the busy street from the darkness of the alley. It was the evening, the sun hanging low in the smog-filled sky. It must be the weekend, a lot more people are out than usual. But he needed to get out of this alley, find something to eat, anything before his mind flashed back, his teeth sinking into cold flesh, yet somehow the blood inside felt so incredibly warm on his tongue, he needed to do it again in Aga. Ken shook his head violently, trying to dislodge the horrible thoughts and memories. He sighed, he needed to get out of here. He tried to ignore the scathing, pity-filled, suspicious looks he received from the people in the street. He tried to ignore the saliva building and filling in his mouth or the way his hands trembled at his sides with the effort of not grabbing someone and tearing into them. He entered a small run-down diner. He'd never been in here before, but he'd walked past a few times. A bell above the door jingled weakly as he entered, catching the attention of an older man sat behind the counter. Ken ignored the attention and took a seat in the far corner, glanced at the menu and saw it blur as his stomach twisted in on itself. He bit back a groan as the waitress approached. She wore a bright but creased uniform, with an all-too-wide but empty smile and an askew name tag stuck to her chest. Mary. His heart dropped into his stomach. That was his mother's name. Good evening. She grinned, awfully chipper with a customer service grin plastered onto her face. Are you ready to order? Ken couldn't take his eyes off of the name tag. Can I just get a burger? He whispered, afraid if he spoke any louder he'd burst into tears. The waitress gave him another smile, jotting down his order onto an old worn notepad. Ken watched her go, his fingers twitching as some deep instinct screamed at him to pounce. She had her back turned. She'd never even notice, it would be an instantaneous death. He growled to himself, tearing his gaze from the waitress onto the table below. His hand pressed tightly against his own stomach, the hunger was destroying him, making him think and act like a wild animal. Minutes later the waitress came back, setting down a chipped plate with a small, greasy burger on it. Enjoy, hun, the waitress said before moving back to the counter, speaking to the old man. It wasn't very busy at all. Ken eyed the burger, not feeling the pull of hunger, not like he did with. He shook his head, the meat looked gray and the bun looked damp and stale at the same time. Still, he forced himself to pick it up, his face grimacing at the texture of the bun. He took a hesitant bite, chewed. His throat tightened, gagging loudly as he spat the burger onto the plate below. His body convulsed as the taste stuck to his mouth. It was like ash in his mouth. It was the worst tasting thing he'd ever put in his mouth. His eyes watered, and he coughed, spitting all remains of the bite out onto the plate below. And then he heard it, clearer than anything. A small hiss from the kitchen, followed by a muffled curse. The cook had cut himself, just a nick. A drop of blood hit the kitchen tile. The smell hit Ken like a freight train. Rich, warm, alive. His pupils dilated, one of his eyes darkened, the iris going a dark dangerous red. His breath quickened, his body tensed and his nails dug into the cheap table below. Wood splintered loudly as Ken tried to anchor himself. The old man behind the counter frowned, grabbing a bat from underneath the till. "Hey," he shouted at the boy. Ken smacked his hand against his face, trying to block out the smell. But it didn't block the sound of Mary's pulse, or the approaching old man's heartbeat. "Hey, you're gonna have to pay for this." The old man, the owner, shouted as he looked down at the table Ken had all but destroyed. All Ken could hear was the man's rapid heartbeat. "Hey, you listening?" Ken bolted from his seat, knocking the old man to the ground as he moved at such speed he blurred. He crashed through the door, ripping one of its hinges off. He tore through the darkening city, as far away from the smell as possible. The low hum of the bat computer filled the cave, accompanied by the distant drip of water echoing off of stone. The light from the large monitor cast a long, dark shadow behind Bruce. The lab was under a private contract. Bruce said flatly as he typed rapidly. "I can find zero records of its existence." Alfred approached quietly, a tray with tea and biscuits balanced neatly in his hands. "I presume they weren't making shampoo, were they, Master Bruce?" Bruce's eyes narrowed as he scrubbed through footage he captured at the lab. He paused it on a specific frame. A cage, hidden in the back of one of the rooms he'd passed, too big for any testing animal. "Human experimentation," he said. "Our target appears to be a test subject named Patient 037. His RC levels are off the charts." Alfred set down the tray beside Bruce, looking at pictures of the equipment and medical forms that had been tracking this Patient 037. "And what, exactly, are RC levels?" Alfred asked. "Unknown," Bruce responded. "Whatever it is, it must have rewrote his physiology." He switched to a picture he'd taken of the room containing this patient. Blood covered the walls, bodies layered the floor below. But what Bruce focused on was the bed, and the thick metal restraints that had been torn apart like paper. Ken stared down into the puddle at his feet. The reflection that stared back wasn't his own. One eye burned a deep, unnatural red, the sclera around it a void black that swallowed the faint city light. Blood slicked his chin and streaked across his cheek, mixing with the rain until it ran in diluted rivulets down his face. The metallic taste lingered on his tongue, rich, intoxicating, wrong. Behind him, half hidden by shadow and rain, lay the limp form of a homeless man. Ken didn't turn around. He couldn't. He just kept staring at his reflection, waiting for it to look human again. "Gotham's killer cannibal. What am I looking at?" Amanda Waller asked as she stared at flickering grainy footage. A teenager, no older than 17, was strapped to a metal slab, heavy metal restraints looped around his wrists. "A private lab, with an unknown benefactor," an agent said and then pointed towards the boy. "That is Patient 037. They were experimenting on him, organ transplantation, injections of something called RC, blood transfusions." The agent clicked his remote, pausing the footage. Waller sighed. Human experimentation was becoming far too common. "RC?" Amanda Waller asked, "and what were the intentions with the experimentation?" The agent couldn't hide the slight wince that slipped through his usual flat expression. Walker caught the look, sensing her agent was about to say something unfavorable. "RC is currently unknown, but we have men scouring through files," the agent said. "The intentions, we believe from what we've found, are to create a ghoul." Amanda Waller furrowed her brows. "A ghoul?" The agent nodded. "That's what they nicknamed the project. It boils down to creating a superhuman that has a hunger for human flesh." Waller looked disturbed. She couldn't fathom why on earth anyone would create a super cannibal. "Do we have the patient contained?" she asked. The agent shook his head. "It escaped. It was much stronger than the scientists anticipated." Waller sighed, frustration evident. "Have we captured any of the scientists?" And again, to Waller's frustration, the agent shook his head. "They're all either dead or missing." "Where was this lab?" she asked, hoping it wasn't anywhere near a city. The agent sighed. "Gotham. We need this contained, now." Waller barked. A news broadcast echoed from a quiet shop window as Ken walked by in his dark stolen hoodie. Authorities have confirmed they are on the trail of a killer cannibal in Gotham. The news anchor said, far too calmly. They have confirmed the discovery of 2 mutilated and partially consumed bodies in East Gotham. Ken had frozen. His hood shadowed his face, but he could see his reflection in the glass. The news anchor kept talking, however her words seemed to have turned to static as horror set in. Only in Gotham, a nearby woman muttered to her concerned-looking boyfriend. We really need to move. Ken walked away, his heart pounding like a war drum. He hadn't been home in days, not since. He shook his head, he hadn't been home. Now it doesn't seem like he'll ever be able to return. Not that he really wanted to, he couldn't face what he'd done. He wonders what his mother would think of him, of what he did. He let out a shaky breath. He'd tried to eat other foods, dozens of other things, but he couldn't swallow any of it. Absolutely nothing, except for human flesh. A deep burning rage was burning, at whoever did this to him. A snarl unknowingly carved itself onto his face. He needed to find them. His fists clenched. He would tear them limb from limb. He thought back to his mother. Whoever did this to him, they would. He heard a scuffle. Ken snapped his head to the source of the sound. A boy, no older than 13, was being pushed against a wall by a ragged-looking man, deep in an alley. The kid let out a pathetic whimper. The man's eyes glimmered in some twisted sense of satisfaction. Maybe he could help, Ken thought to himself. Your daddy owes me money, the man growled, his hand tightening its tight grip on the boy's small neck. Go tell him. The ragged man never got to finish his sentence. A gruesome crack echoed through the alley. The sound of something heavy hitting a brick wall soon followed. The boy looked up at what had been his attacker. What? The boy whined, horror evident in his wide-eyed gaze as a river of blood started to pour onto his jacket. The man was still standing there, but jaw was gone. Not broken, gone. What was left of his face was a ruin of splintered bone, shredded muscle, and blood. His teeth were scattered across the pavement like shattered glass. A black-haired teenager stood next to the mutilated man, his trembling fist outstretched. The little boy ran, tears forming his eyes at the horror and the thick, heavy smell of blood clinging to him. Ken was frozen, looking down at his bloody hand. Why couldn't he do anything right? A wet gargling sound filled the alley, coming from the ragged, now broken man. Ken felt sick. He stumbled backwards, his foot slipping in blood. His vision blurred as he wiped his eyes, staining his face red. A horrified gasp at the entrance of the alley snapped him back into his right mind. Ken's bloodshot eyes darted toward the sound. A woman stood frozen, her groceries spilled across the wet pavement, trembling as she took in the scene, the mangled man, the shattered jaw, and the teenage boy standing over him, chest heaving. Her scream tore through the city. Ken bolted. He ended up in the sewers. At least down here the stench covered the smell of human flesh. The air was thick and wet, every breath tasting like mold. His footsteps echoed through the lonely tunnels. He came to a stop, letting out a defeated sigh. He fell back against a sewer wall, sliding down until he hit the cold, damp concrete below. His hands were trembling, covered in slowly drying blood. He wanted to cry, scream, to eat. He just wanted. The water rippled. Ken's attention fixed onto the running water. The way it just rippled was unnet. The water exploded. Ken was hit like a truck, the sheer impact bouncing him off the wall and into the deep sewer water. Ken tried to twist and see whatever had hit him, only for the giant dark figure to slam into him again. Ken was propelled back first into the concrete below. He felt himself choke and gag as filth filled his lungs. The sound of the rushing water deafened him as he desperately kicked out his legs, hoping to get away. Then his arm was grabbed in a vice-like grip. The thing dragged him upwards like he weighed nothing, scraping his body against concrete and rusted metal. Ken thrashed, clawing at the gigantic hand encircling his forearm. The thing let out a deep, low rumble that seemed to vibrate every bone in Ken's body. The teenager was dragged out of the water with a splash. He fell to all fours, desperately coughing up sewage and bile, hoping to grasp just some air. His lungs screamed and his throat burned. Why was he so pathetic? A heavy, wet footstep echoed through the tunnel. Ken tilted his head up, his eyes widened as he took in the towering figure. Rough, dark green scales covered its muscular figure. Its hands that idly flexed were the size of Ken's torso. But the worst thing was the eyes. They were an acidic yellow, but the look in its eyes was one that Ken recognized. Hunger. 15 comments, 0 vote. The monster in the sewer. Ken knew what this monster was. Everyone heard the rumors. The cannibal hidden in Gotham sewers. Killer Croc. It grinned, showing off its mouth, filled with fresh blood and sharp teeth. It must have been at least 8 feet tall and weighed as much as a small car. Ken tried to scan his surroundings, looking for an exit. But the only one he saw was behind the monster, if only he could. The croc lunged. Ken barely had time to react. A blur of claws and teeth filled his vision. Instinct drove him to dive to the side. The creature's jaw slammed shut, where his head had been moments ago. He hit the ground hard. His lungs heaved, his ears rung and eyes watered. He looked up at the exit. Ken pushed himself up, slipping on wet concrete as he ran. He needed to move. Something twisted in his chest as he fled, again. He really was pathetic. He was closing in on the exit. He was pathetic but alive. A clawed hand clamped around his leg. Ken's blood ran cold as he fell forward, smashing his face onto the concrete below with a gruesome crack. The sharp, jagged claws slowly dug into Ken's calf. Ken dug his fingers into the concrete below, but it didn't offer any resistance as he was pulled towards the beast. The monster laughed, jagged and broken. He's laughing, Ken thought. Laughing, at me. Rage and fear collided in his chest. He grit his teeth, muscles coiling like springs, and with a sudden twist he drove himself up towards the clawed hand clamped around his leg. Ken didn't know why, but he bit down and his teeth sunk deep. The rich taste of flesh and blood exploded across his tongue. The croc roared, a deafening guttural sound that reached even the city above. But most importantly, he let go. And by the time the croc glanced back down, Ken was gone. Ken sat in front of an old computer in a public library. He was damp, bloody and smelt of literal sewage. To be completely honest, he expected to be sent away. And by some of the looks he was getting from people walking by, they wished he had been. Ken looked down at his leg, bloody, but his wounds had disappeared. Or healed. Those scientists had obviously done something to him, and it was time he started doing something about it. This whole time he'd only been reacting. If he wanted to get fixed, he needed initiative. He started by looking into human enhancement and potential side effects. He ended up finding hundreds if not thousands of academic articles. It was a very well-researched topic, but there was one problem. Not many research studies on enhanced subjects were available, so it really only came down to theories and speculation. Another problem was that none of these studies mentioned craving human flesh as a side effect. He shook his head. He was unique then. Maybe, whatever they did to him, went wrong. Or maybe he was meant to be different, that the cravings were intentional. He started to research cannibalism and what made someone crave human flesh. But it came to a dead end. The vast majority of the results skewed towards the psychological rather than physiological. Hours passed as he delved into more studies, into everything he could get his hands onto, and he quickly came to the conclusion that he needed to find exactly what the scientists had done to him, and what he now could do. All Ken really knew about his enhancements were that he was strong and couldn't eat any food other than human flesh. He then started to research creatures that ate human flesh, real or mythological. Because when things like Superman existed, he couldn't rule anything out, not even folklore. He came across hundreds. Slowly he worked his way through each creature, the cryptid and mythological included. Eventually he came across one that caught his full attention. Ghouls are humanoid beings with physiology altered to require human flesh for sustenance. While similar to humans, ghouls exhibit enhanced strength, speed and regenerative abilities. One of their most distinctive features is the kakugan, a condition in which the sclera darkens and the iris glows crimson when the ghoul's predatory instincts are triggered. Ken froze. Every description matched him, every symptom, every craving. His hands shook as he continued. In folklore, ghouls are primarily nocturnal, hunting humans to survive. They possess heightened senses allowing them to track prey effectively. Ghouls demonstrate territorial behavior and can display extreme violence when hungry or provoked. He let out a shaky sigh as he slumped his shoulders forward and dropped his head. What the hell had those scientists done to him? Jesus, Ken whispered shakily, his mind was racing. How could he reverse this? Was it even possible? Hey, a voice from behind startled Ken. The teenager snapped his head towards the person only to see a girl, around his age, holding some clothes. She had red hair, an awkward smile, and had a staff lanyard around her neck. Staff. Oh, hello, Ken responded, assuming he was about to be asked to leave. I fetched these from Lost and Found, she said as she presented the folded clothes in her arms. I don't mean to be rude, just thought you might want to change. Ken blinked, looking at her with wide surprised eyes. Yeah, that would be nice, he responded, only to blink when she also handed him a leaflet. He looked down at it curiously. Wayne Shelter. It's a homeless shelter for teenagers, the girl said. They have a shower, food, everything you might need. Ken felt his cheeks warm, with embarrassment. I don't mean to be rude, we just get a lot of kids who come here that need help, the girl rushed to say. It's nothing to be embarrassed about. No, it's fine, Ken interrupted, giving the girl a small smile. Thank you. She smiled right back. 21 comments, 0 vote. Map of death. The water was cold and had a weird smell to it, but Ken couldn't care less as he scrubbed himself red raw under the rusty shower head. It had been over a week since he took a shower. Technically longer, he wasn't showering however long those scientists had him. He ran his hands through his soaked dark hair as he applied a cheap shampoo. He thought about what his next steps are. Does he go to a hero? To the police? Maybe they could fix him. Or would they just lock him up? And it wouldn't be unreasonable, he'd eaten his own mother after all. He certainly wouldn't seem sympathetic once he lets that slip. He couldn't control himself, he knew that. But if even he couldn't forgive himself for what he did, why would anyone else? He rinsed his hair underneath the cold water. He needed to start his life again. He couldn't go back to school, he couldn't go back home. They'd ask where he'd been, and if he knew what happened to his mother. The police would suspect him, all they would need to do is check his dental records and compare them to the bite wounds. His stomach growled. Ken gritted his teeth. Hunger, that was the biggest problem. He couldn't just kill and eat humans. His mind flashed back to the ragged man who was threatening that child. The gurgles, the wide terrified eyes and the blood that spurted from the man's wound. He shook his head. It was necessary, he tried to tell himself, not that it worked. Ken paused, coming to a realization. He didn't necessarily need to kill anyone. Any updates on that lab massacre, Master Bruce? Alfred asked as he patched up a particularly nasty wound on his master's back. Bruce just let out a tired sigh. Bad news then, Alfred surmised. I found a piece of CCTV, of a young boy in a bloody hospital robe running, unnaturally fast through East Gotham. Bruce said. Alfred however furrowed his brows, that was clearly the patient. Is that not good news? Alfred asked. It means he is on the loose in Gotham. Bruce intoned. And I have reason to believe, he might have cannibalistic urges. Alfred paused. What brought you to that conclusion? I visited the lab again, I found some files that were missed by the team that scrubbed it all. Bruce said as he sat up, stretching his arms over his head. The only thing they fed patient 037 was raw, human flesh. Alfred hummed. Sadism, he offered it as a weak counter. Bruce shook his head. They also kept him under anesthetic, they only fed him human flesh, because it was necessary. Necessary for what? Alfred asked, his curiosity getting the best of him. I don't know, not yet. Bruce said, his jaw tensing. He never liked not knowing something, even as a young boy. So we have a new meta, killing and eating humans. Alfred summarized, only in Gotham. No, Bruce suddenly interrupted. No, he doesn't need to kill anyone. The black-haired man stood, rushing over to the Bat computer. His fingers flew across the keys, dozens of files and data feeds spilling across the massive screens. Alfred followed, brow furrowed. And what exactly are we looking for, Master Bruce? Patterns, Bruce replied. Gotham's crime statistics haven't changed this week, not enough to suggest a predator roaming the streets. He pulled up another window, overlaying timestamps and heat maps. If a meta was hunting, we'd see spikes. Missing persons, witness reports, panic threads online. But it's quiet. Alfred caught on. But what about the killer cannibal, on the loose? Is that not the meta? Bruce nodded. I suspect it is, however the woman found cannibalized had been dead for a whole day prior, and the homeless man. Ah, Alfred interrupted, it wasn't uncommon for the homeless to die in their sleep. So you believe that our patient is only eating the deceased? Bruce nodded. A crime, yes, but what if he can't control himself? What if the experiment changed him to such an extent, he can no longer consume anything but human flesh? Bruce continued to rapidly type, pulling up a map of Gotham with several large, dark circles marking several locations. Alfred took a step forward, taking a look at the graph. Before he could even ask, Bruce spoke, though his tone was softer. This is a graph of suicides in the city. Alfred's eyes went wide, coming to the realization that Bruce was suggesting. You believe that the patient will seek out suicide victims? Yes, Bruce declared. Ken was wearing the clothes the girl from the library had given him. A dark black tee that was a bit too small on him, fitting tightly. Then he wore gray joggers that were slightly too big. He rapidly typed on the public library computer, pulling up graphs and statistics and marking certain locations onto a hand-drawn map of Gotham. It was nearing midnight, yet the library was still open. The receptionist said it was funded by Bruce Wayne. Ken had to admit, for all the extravagant parties filled with supermodels and celebrities the billionaire threw, he did 3 times as much charity work. Ken continued rapidly tearing through data, comparing statistics from different sources to find a realistic average. Each red dot he marked on the map was the location of a confirmed suicide that had occurred in the last year. Already the dots were beginning to form a pattern. There were hotspots. Gotham's suicide rate was remarkably high, but putting it onto a graph really put it into perspective. It's not a surprise, the poverty and crime was awful, and that's before the mafia or the serial villains that stalked Gotham's streets were mentioned. One of his old classmates' mother had been blinded by the Joker. He really doesn't understand why someone hasn't put a bullet in that thing's head. He paused at that thought. Maybe the problem with Gotham was that nobody did what it needed. He glanced down at the red dots. Maybe there would have been less of them, if only someone stood up to it all. 15 comments 0 vote. Scavenging in Revelation. The outskirts of Gotham was quiet in a way Gotham's city center could never be. Not with the state of things as they are now. He looked down at his makeshift map. He was in a dark forest. A common hotspot. His senses were on high alert. The slightest breeze of wind caused him to pause. He needed to be careful. He thought back to the woman who had seen him punch that man's jaw off. He already had a witness that saw his face as clear as day. Every step he took felt precise, calculated to make as little noise as possible. He checked the map again. This was it. He was on the bank of the Gotham Harbor. Far above was a bridge that led into the city. The air here was fresh, different from the usual smog-filled sky in the city. The water reflected the pale moonlight, as pretty a sight you'll ever see in Gotham. But then he smelled it. He almost let out a satisfied groan. Before he'd even realized it, he'd started to walk faster. The scent was addictive, it called to him. He closed in on the smell, seeing the body in the distance. It was fresh. It must have happened tonight. Something about that made him want to cry. But he didn't. He kept walking. It was a man, wearing a disheveled suit, his skull split wide open. Ken looked up at the bridge. He must have jumped. Ken kneeled by the man, analyzing his bloody, shattered face. He couldn't help but wonder what went wrong, what caused him to do this. His stomach growled. Ken shook his head, and before he could think twice, he dug his teeth into the man's neck. Blood covered his face as Ken let out a relieved groan. Before he could swallow the first bite, he dived in for a second. Minutes later he pulled back, his breath ragged, his chin slick with cold, wet blood. He looked down at what was left of the man. Ken had made sure to leave the already destroyed face alone. It felt cruel, unnecessary to completely destroy this person. He stood, waiting there for a long moment, intently observing the corpse. Then he turned away. He would leave the body there, half devoured and sure to be found. But it was better that way. Better the man's family knew what happened, and that they get something back. Better than just disappearing, like he did. Ken walked back to the shelter. He'd washed himself off in the harbor. It was a long walk, but he didn't mind. It allowed his mind to roam. It was late at night, so the only people up would likely be the security and receptionist. The place had 24/7 staff. It was clearly well funded. "Hey," a girl's voice whispered from a nearby staff room. Ken's head snapped in the direction of the sound, only to pause. It was the red-headed girl from the library. Ken's brows furrowed. "You work here?" he asked. "I volunteer on some of the night shifts," she replied, looking him up and down as she approached. "I'm glad to see you came. Thank you for telling me about this place," Ken responded, though he still felt embarrassed to be here in some ways. It was like he was weak. "Not many actually ever show up," she explained, a soft look in her eyes. Ken wasn't surprised. Her eyes ran across him again, glad he was wearing clean clothes, the ones he wore in the library. Ken noticed her friendly smile drop. He felt something cold settle in his stomach at the sudden change. "Rough night?" she asked, looking at his hands. He looked down. noticing extremely faint amounts of blood underneath his trimmed fingernails. How did she even notice that? Ken forced a nod and attempted a casual smile. Yeah, something like that. He chuckled awkwardly. Her gaze lingered. Ken clenched his jaw, holding back from snatching his hand away. That would look even more suspicious. Anyway, I'd better get off to sleep. He tried to smile at her, but it ended up as more of a wince. He walked past her, going towards his large shared room. The Batmobile came to a screeching stop, the tires leaving deep rivets in the wet ground below. This was the third hotspot he'd been to that night. He was tracking patient 037. He got out of the Batmobile, his cape flapping in a sudden breeze. Bruce looked up to the bridge above, a deep sadness drowning him as the significance of this place gripped him. He started to walk along the bay, stopping when he saw it. A man, or what was left of him, crumbled on the harbor bank. His skull was shattered, eyes glassy and mouth forever open. Bruce rushed over, dropping to his knees by the man. Everything below the neck and above the belly was practically gone. Only skeleton and wiry fibers of muscle remained. He felt a deep sense of guilt. He always did when he found something like this. If only I got here sooner. Laid next to the corpse was a folded suit jacket, shirt and tie. Laid underneath the tie was a handwritten note. Bruce skimmed through it. It was a suicide note. No clues. He folded it back up, placing it back beneath the tie. Bruce rose to his feet, looking at the scene from a new perspective. The wounds on the skull looked consistent with a fall from the bridge. Bruce pressed a button on his utility belt, sending his location and an alarm to the police department. But two things were clear: patient 037 had done this and that Bruce was right about him. He was scavenging. How did it go, Master Bruce? Alfred asked as Bruce returned to the cave. The air smelled faintly of smoke and rain. Bruce didn't answer right away, just nodded once and strode to the Batcomputer. His cape trailed behind him, silent but heavy. I've confirmed my suspicions, he said curtly, fingers already flying across the keyboard. I also have a new one. Alfred arched his brow. And that is? Bruce's jaw tightened. To the identity of our patient. Oh, Alfred asked, his interest rising. Ken Cross, Bruce declared as he brought up a photo. An old school picture, a boy no older than 15, dark unruly hair, bright grin. Innocent. Alfred stepped closer, eyes narrowing. Why him? Bruce didn't look up. I started reviewing the feeding patterns. So far, he's consumed 3 victims. A suicide victim, a homeless man, and a mother, Alfred recalled, his tone grim. Bruce nodded. The first 2 fit a pattern of opportunistic scavenging, already dead victims. But the third? The mother, Alfred said quietly. She was the first one found, in her apartment, Bruce continued. No signs of forced entry. Which suggests a personal connection. Alfred's brow furrowed. You believe he knew her? I checked missing persons reports, Bruce said. The victim, Mary Cross, filed one 2 weeks before her death. Her son had vanished. Alfred froze. His voice came out low. Master Bruce, you're not implying that patient 037 ate his own? Yes. Bruce's tone was flat, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something, pity, maybe. I believe Ken Cross returned home after escaping the lab. He found his mother dead and lost control. Silence filled the cave. The monitors hummed softly in the dark. Finally, Alfred spoke, voice faint. Good Lord. 10 comments 0 vote. First meeting. Ken was in the shelter, reading a book on Japanese folklore he borrowed from the library. He was hoping to find any more information about ghouls, but right now his concentration was being interrupted. There was some sort of commotion towards the main entrance. It had been going on for quite a few minutes, however he hadn't heard screams or anything of the like. So what could it be? Ken stood, curiosity getting the better of him, and hoped he could see over the building crowd of homeless teenagers. Only to freeze. Bruce Wayne, in the thick of the crowd, a bright casual smile on his sharp face. He was shaking someone's hand. It was an adult. Ken hadn't seen him around before. He was easily chatting with the wide-eyed teenagers and even signing autographs. Ken glanced around. He wasn't the only teenager hanging back. Some looked too nervous, some looked like they didn't really care, and the others, they looked resentful. Eyes burning with envy, rage and loathing for the Prince of Gotham. Yet the billionaire had no bodyguards, there were no cameras, or women to impress. It actually seemed genuine. Then all too suddenly, the billionaire's bright blue eyes flicked up, straight towards him. For a moment, not even a single second, their eyes met. Then his focus shifted, onto one of the countless people surrounding him. Ken quickly dropped his head, trying to read his book. He was still on a page about ghouls, but he just couldn't concentrate. Ken glanced back up. Bruce Wayne was now making his way around the shelter. An older man stood right beside him, gesturing and explaining something Ken couldn't hear over all the commotion. Ken dropped his head once more, diving into the book as he slumped back against the far too soft communal sofa. He felt stupid. He kept reading the first line but he completely forgot what had happened seconds later. He shook his head. He was getting frustrated as he went back to the beginning to reread the line. Ghouls are what I consider the natural predator to Huma. What are you reading? Ken snapped his head up. Bruce Wayne stood a few feet away, hands casually in his pockets. The surrounding commotion had died down, but just because he didn't have a crowd standing around him, didn't mean he didn't have dozens of eyes glued to him. Ken felt the eyes. He didn't like it. Japanese folklore, he said, embarrassment rising to his cheeks. He really hoped Bruce Wayne didn't think he was obsessed with Japan or something. He wasn't. Not because I'm Japan obsessed or anything, Ken rushed to explain. I'm just looking for something specific, he finished lamely. Bruce Wayne didn't seem bothered by his awkward explanation. In fact, the man seemed interested as he all too casually dropped into the seat beside Ken. Ken couldn't help the surprise that filled him at the billionaire's move. Something specific? Bruce Wayne asked as he eyed the page Ken was currently on. Ken shrugged. Yeah, but I think I'll find it soon, he responded cryptically. Bruce nodded, his eyes lit up with interest as he eyed Ken. So what's your name? Bruce asked. Ken felt another wave of surprise but was getting used to it. Bruce Wayne was peculiar. Ken, I'm Bruce. How was the visit, Master Bruce? Alfred asked the man as he returned from his visit to a teenager's homeless shelter. Bruce hummed. He was holding a book, its price tag still visible. It went well. I have reason to believe patient 037 is undoubtedly Ken, Bruce said as he set the book down on an old, but expensive wooden cabinet. And that conclusion came from? Alfred prompted. He's researching folklore, specifically I saw him on a page about ghouls, Bruce said as he took off his expensive suit jacket, hanging it onto a coat hanger. A ghoul? Alfred questioned. It's a creature from Japanese folklore. It looks human but feeds on human flesh, Bruce finished, his tone even as he loosened his tie. I believe he's studying, looking for answers. Alfred nodded. He's looking for something to rationalize his cravings. Bruce nodded. I also found out that ghouls cannot consume anything other than human flesh. Bruce dropped into a seat, facing Alfred. I asked about him, and the staff noticed he is never around during meal times. So you believe he has no other option than human flesh? Alfred asked, assessing Bruce. That's a leap. What if he simply prefers human flesh? Bruce didn't respond, and Alfred noticed a stubborn look in his eyes. You are particularly interested in this case, Alfred observed. Bruce was far more emotionally invested than usual. Can I ask why? Bruce didn't respond right away, but when he finally spoke his voice was quieter, almost reluctant. Because he's not a monster, yet. There was a heavy, tension-filled pause. Alfred took a slow step closer, his tone soft but cutting. You're thinking of young Jason, aren't you? Eyes on target, a detached voice announced. Copy that, another replied, tone clipped and sterile. Maintain line of sight, do not engage until signal. Gotham's rooftops were a maze of wet concrete and rusting ventilation. The foggy city below unaware of the manhunt crawling over its skin. A light mist hung in the air, catching the warm glow of the streetlights. The rooftops glistened like oil. Somewhere in the distance a siren wailed. Typical Gotham, but none of that was the focus. It was on patient 037. The target was young with black hair. Seemingly unaware of the eyes tracking his every move, he walked without care through the isolated industrial district. A black SUV idled 2 over blocks back, lights off. 2 streets ahead, in their target's predicted path were 3 undercover agents. A dark drone hovered above, invisible in the constant fog that haunted Gotham. Ken turned down a narrow street, shallow puddles bursting beneath his feet as he quickened his pace. He glanced behind him, just once. Nothing, but a chill crawled up his spine regardless. Somebody was watching him. 16 comments 0 vote, ghoul. Tension filled his every step. He knew someone, something was there. But he didn't know why, where and how they'd found him. His mind raced through all reasonable possibilities. Who would have a motive? Batman, Killer Croc, his breath caught in his throat. The laboratory, the people that kidnapped him, he's sure human experimentation isn't cheap. They wanted him back. Another chill crawled up his spine. If he didn't play this right, he could be put back under. He had only brief memories of the laboratory, being knocked out, flashes of consciousness and a deep, painful hunger that never seemed to subside. He tried to play through all possible scenarios. Could he run? Or should he pretend he hadn't noticed anything? But they likely knew how to find him. Did that mean they knew about the shelter? His blood ran cold. That would mean he had nowhere to run. They would find him. He forced himself to breathe evenly. Trying to calm himself down, he was thinking ahead. He needed to think about what to do now. He could hear it now, faint footsteps from the rooftops. The almost inaudible hum of a car engine, somewhere just out of sight. Were they closing in, or had they been this close the whole time? He continued walking, trying to figure the quickest way possible back to the shelter. Whoever they were, surely they wouldn't be bold enough to attack a homeless shelter. Too many witnesses, it would draw far too much attention. And even if they did, he'd have better chances there. More people, more chaos. Here though, the streets were practically empty and he was being actively tracked. But they hadn't attacked yet, for a reason. They must be waiting for the best possible chance. If he kept walking the expected path, he'd fall straight into the trap likely waiting for him. If this was the laboratory, they knew his abilities better than he did. The car he'd heard earlier was getting closer. He didn't turn to look, not yet. He could feel the rumble of the engine through the pavement. It was going the exact speed limit. Every other car that had passed was doing almost double. Headlights washed over his back as the blacked-out SUV pulled alongside Ken and matched his walking pace. The driver's side tinted window rolled down. "Hey kid, could you show?" Ken pivoted, planting his heel as he drove his foot straight into the driver's door. Bang! The impact sounded like a gunshot. The metal buckled inwards as the SUV lurched sideways, its tires screaming before it flipped onto its side. Ken was already running, his figure a distant blur as he tore down side streets and alleys. He could hear men on the rooftops surrounding him, and the further he ran, the sheer scale of this operation was made known to him. Continuous gunfire cracked through the night, the hiss of tranquilizer darts sparking against brick and metal tearing through the night as Ken eyed a nearby fire escape. He didn't hesitate. He jumped onto a dumpster, using it as a springboard to grab onto the edge of a fire escape. Metal groaned beneath his fingers and the entire frame shuddered from his weight. Ken hauled himself up the rusted stairs. Bullets continued to rain as he threw himself up towards the roof above, the cold Gotham wind tearing past him as he did. Ken eyed the surrounding roofs. Plenty of other men were stationed here. A tranquilizer zipped past his ear and shattered against a vent ahead of him, close enough that he felt the air shift. Ken ran, sprinting full force as he vaulted over ducts and leapt between buildings with the speed of a car. He didn't once hesitate as he threw himself into the void, his instincts controlling him as his mind took a backseat. One of his eyes burned a blood red, his heartbeat pounding in his skull and muscles screaming as he truly used them for the first time since the experiment. Above him, in the dark clouds, a red light flashed. Ken eyed it, yet he continued to run. He'd long since lost the men on foot. He was too fast. It flashed again, almost invisible in the clouds. Yet Ken could see a vague outline. It was a drone. They were watching him, tracking him until he got tired. Ken stopped running. The drone mimicked him. For a heartbeat, the world held still, the sirens, the wind, even the rain. Then he bent his knees. The roof cracked under the pressure. He launched himself upward like a spring-loaded weapon, cutting through the air in a blur. His hand shot out, grabbing the metal body of the drone. With one brutal twist. Crunch. Sparks burst in a shower of red light as the drone tumbled, shattered, into the streets below. Ken landed hard, shoes scraping against the roof's edge. He exhaled sharply, a faint mist escaping his mouth. Now he could escape. 39 comments, 0 vote. The Bat and the Ghoul. Ken staggered forward, eyes snapping to the entrance of the alley before he dropped back behind a bin. His heart hammered against his chest like a war drum as sirens echoed through the dark city. He let out a shaky breath, his right hand tightened around a piece of metal he'd ripped from the drone. He looked down at it. It was bent, warping from his strength. Ken still didn't fully understand what the laboratory had done to him, but it had made him strong. And they wanted him back. His fists clenched, the metal screeching and bending underneath the pressure. His stomach twisted in a constant, everlasting hunger that never truly disappeared, but Ken ignored it. He needed to decide where to go now. He could go back to the shelter, but whoever had just tried to capture him would likely know instantly. But would they risk that attention? Attacking a shelter for homeless teenagers sounded like the perfect way to get the Batman's attention. He spent a while thinking to himself, thinking about his options, and only came to the conclusion that the shelter was the best option. If anyone came for him, Ken looked down at his clenched fist, the metal crumpled into a heavy ball. He eyed the shelter from the depths of a dark alley, his eyes roaming down the shelter and road. He was looking for signs, anything that would point. An expensive car. Ken blinked, his head tilting slightly as he assessed the dark car. It had black tinted windows and it was still running. Ken stepped back into the shadows of the alley. His senses sharpened as he took another step back. That was suspicious, beyond suspicious. He bumped into something. His body pounced back, feet skidding back against the concrete as his vibrant red and black Kakugan flared to life with panic. What he saw through the dark night only furthered that panic. A tall man, if it could even be called that, wearing all black with a large swooping cape that hung from his broad shoulders. Two distinct, iconic spikes poked up from his dark helmet. Batman. Ken swallowed, memories of Batman's reputation running through his head as he took a shaky step back. In the face of the personification of Gotham's fury, he forgot about his strength, his speed, any form of confidence. But what the man said surpassed any horrible expectation Ken had. "You're safe now." He had said it in a gruff, deep tone, but a tone that was filled to the brim with an odd kindness. Ken had frozen at the words, swallowing as his eyes snapped up to Batman's white lenses. What?" he asked. "I want to help you, Ken," the man said. Ken swallowed again, his hands feeling shaky. "You know who I am?" Ken asked in a whisper, memories of his mother, the people he'd eaten playing through his head. The man in the mask only nodded. "Ken Cross," he said evenly. 16, missing for 6 months. Mother reported you went missing when you went. Ken interrupted, his breath stuttering in his chest at the words. "She reported it." Silence. "Yes," the man eventually responded calmly, no judgment or accusation present in his voice. Ken's stomach twisted again, but not in hunger. "I want to help, just listen to me." But Batman didn't give the boy time to think as he nodded towards the parked car outside of the shelter. The car across the street, the plates are cloned with heavy engine and frame modifications. The man began, changing the subject entirely. "They're not your average thug. They're looking for me," Ken said, his eyes snapping to the running car. Batman nodded. "So come with me," the man said, his eyes locked onto the teenager. The man outstretched his hand in offering towards the black-haired teenager. Ken only shook his head. You don't understand," he said in a shaky tone. "I've got something wrong with me, I have to." "I know," Batman interrupted. "That's why I want to help you, it's not your fault." Ken's heart roared in his ears, he couldn't understand how any of this was happening. Did he really understand? Ken felt his knees wobble as he stepped forward and took the man's hand, his head bowing as finally, anyone, saw him. The car was insane. It was beyond modern, it looked like a rocket ship when Ken got in besides the towering man. He looked out of the windows as they blurred through Gotham's dark streets. Eventually they got to the outskirts of Gotham. That's when a privacy shield over the windshield activated, Ken not being able to see out of it anymore. The cockpit was dark, the only light source coming from the dark blue glowing dashboard. The car purred beneath him as they came to gradual stop. Ken couldn't help but feel nervous as his fingers tapped rapidly against his knees. He could hear running water. The privacy shield deactivated. Ken gasped. It was a cave, a Gothic cathedral with massive limestone pillars reaching into the darkness above. A waterfall thundered nearby, Ken looking towards it in shock. Hundreds of bats fluttered above, their chirps filling the cave with a constant static. A massive assortment of monitors were placed onto a wall, altogether it looked bigger than a cinema screen. A dashboard with just as many buttons laid at its feet, glowing buttons lining it. The doors to the car opened with a hiss. Ken undid his seatbelt, stepping out in awe. A large penny, the size of a van, stood upright in the corner of the room. Ken couldn't help but smile, his mind filled with the awe and excitement this place let out in him. An old man, holding a tray with a singular glass of water approached. Master B, the man cut himself off as if he choked, but continued. I've prepared the medical wing for you. The old man was wearing a neat tuxedo, his expression was that of calm professionalism. Batman nodded, but Ken spoke up in confusion. Medical wing, he asked, thinking back to the laboratory. Had he made a mistake? Just for blood tests, to try and find you a cure. Batman quickly clarified to Ken, who looked at him in shock. Cure? He asked in overwhelming hope. 15 comments 0 vote. Medical bay. He was sitting in a medical bed, but unlike the last time he was in one, he wasn't strapped down. He also didn't have multiple scientists poking and prodding at him. He only had the old man, Alfred. The first needle the man used to try and pierce Ken's skin didn't work, it bent instead. But he didn't seem surprised, or even the slightest bit perturbed as he fetched a different type of needle that vibrated rapidly, which pierced his skin, but still with some difficulty. He had been weighed, measured, his shoulder, waist, every possible measurement Ken could think of. He had taken urine samples, spit, even hair and skin. The hole the needle had left had already healed. Ken glanced down in fascination, his body was terrifying. The old man, Alfred, had uploaded his sample results onto their data center. Your skin is stronger than steel, the man said in astonishment, Ken's eyes widening at the words. Your body is almost 6 times as dense as an average human, your reflexes are off the chart. The man continued, to Ken's amazement and horror. What had that laboratory done to him? Alfred looked down at the results in wide-eyed surprise, shaking his head as he clearly needed a few more tests. An X-ray, CT scan, DEXA scan, maybe even bone samples, but Alfred doubted he'd even be able to pierce the bone. Ken's stomach growled, in its constant unending hunger. All the amazement disappeared. He hated this body. Bruce watched as the results were uploaded in real time, rapidly delving into them as he compared them to the laboratory's data. He compared them to any other meta-humans he had samples from, compared them to normal humans. He delved deep as he cross-sectioned and examined the results. They were off the charts. The boy was most likely bulletproof with enough strength to lift a truck overhead. But he was unstable. The boy was clearly scared of his own body, his own urges and instincts. But then the body scans were uploaded and any thoughts of meta-normalcy left Bruce's mind. This wasn't a normal meta-human. Not even a normal experiment. The boy had 3 extra organs. Bruce scanned the results in wide-eyed confusion. His fingers tapped against the keyboard rapidly, his eyes scanning the screen as he started analyzing the organs and comparing them to his database. He'd seen Kryptonian biology, Amazonian density, even Martian shapeshifting, but this was weird, unique. Bruce couldn't find a single other organ that even resembled this anywhere in his massive database. The computer knit together a 3D render of Ken's body, the anomalies highlighted as he clicked a button on the large dashboard. He went back to the lab's data, focusing on the RC cells the lab had mentioned were present in abundance in Ken. This must be their storage. The creator of the cell. Alfred. Bruce's voice cut across their comms. The 3 sacs lining the lower lumbar and mid-thoracic spine aren't tumors, they're the generators and storage of his RC cells. I need another closer scan of those sacs, Alfred. Bruce asked through the comms, his fingers rapidly moving across the dashboard as he took notes. A few minutes later the scans were uploaded. Bruce focused on the lower spine in particular. He analyzed it, ran a quick simulation on the sacs. They were filled with a highly dense liquid. The computer struggled to calculate the mass. It was like Ken was carrying 3 small, organic black holes of compressed proteins. He pressed a button on the dashboard, sending the results to one of the world's experts on meta-alien physiology. Silas Stone. This was beyond Bruce. The dark-haired man quickly switched back towards the other samples. The urine and saliva. The man cross-referenced them, comparing them to a normal human, and his heart almost instantly sank. He wasn't processing glucose. His body completely rejected standard human ATP cycles. The boy was in a state of constant, high-functioning starvation. He looked at the medical wing camera feed. The teenager was already clutching his stomach with trembling hands. The lab didn't give him superpowers. Not in the slightest. They turned him into the world's apex predator. With only one source of food. Humanity. 14 comments 0 vote. Food. Ken had barely slept. The medical wing room's bed was comfortable. The only problem was the amalgamation of machines that were attached to him during the night, tracking any possible activity. Alfred had said he would only sleep there for one night, and that he would get his own guest room tomorrow. But Ken had the slight feeling like he was being locked away, like they were making sure he didn't eat them during the night. His stomach growled. Even thinking about eating put him on edge. Ken shook his head, hair hanging over his eyes as one of his hands pressed hard against his stomach, his fingers clawed as if to rip it out. His fingers trembled at the pressure as he kept pressing, harder. The door opened. Ken's hand ripped back, as if struck, his head snapping up towards the door. "How did you sleep?" Batman asked, his gaze lingering on Ken's still clawed hand. Ken eyed the masked man for a moment before answering, as if not sure whether to tell the truth or not. "Bad," Ken answered, his tone flat as his stomach twisted in a deep, dangerous hunger. He didn't want to mention it. He really didn't. He didn't want Batman to think bad of him, but he just couldn't. His hand gripped his stomach as he bent forward over it. His head dropped, his Kakugan, red and black eye activating at the roaring hunger. He was hungry. He was so hungry. Eat. Flesh, hunger, blood, Ken. Batman didn't raise his voice, didn't reach for restraints or sedatives. The man stepped forward. Ken's vision suddenly blurred, going red at the edges as his heart pulsed and beat like a war drum. He could smell old traces of blood covering the man's suit. He groaned. He could smell the old blood, could hear Batman's beating heart, he could almost taste. His fingers dug into the mattress below, the soft material giving under his strength like slime. "I can hear it," Ken rasped. He didn't mean to say it out loud. "I know," Batman responded. No fear, no accusation. Ken's breathing was ragged, his Kakugan blaring brightly as he looked up towards the towering man. "I don't," he forced out. "I don't want to think like this." Batman stepped closer, pulling a small wrapped package out from behind him. "I've been up, making something," the man said as he fearlessly extended his hand out to the starving teenager. Ken took it with shaking hands, resisting the urge to snatch Batman's wrist and bite. He unwrapped it, slowly revealing the contents as a block of meat. But it didn't smell like meat, didn't feel like meat, didn't leak like meat, it wasn't. "It's artificial, built using your cells, so it should be compatible," Batman said. "I'm not entirely sure how your physiology." Ken snapped down, his teeth sinking into the meat but not meat violently, and with a shake of his head he tore it, swallowing it in one gulp like a crocodile. He swallowed the food, tasting nothing. But he didn't throw up, could feel his mind slowly clearing as hunger was momentarily kept at bay. He bit down again, this time slower, this time he chewed. Batman just watched. They were in a large gym, almost as big as the cave itself, filled with highly specialized equipment Ken had never seen before. Batman leads him towards the far side of the gym, a separate room filled with a unique set of equipment. Ken's brows furrowed as Batman led him towards a bench, but instead of a bar was a large slab of metal attached to a giant machine above. "What's this?" Ken asked, his eyes following Batman as he adjusted something on it. "Think of it as a bench press, but built for people like Superman," Batman summarized as he guided Ken to the flat bench. Ken laid down, looking up at the large slab of metal. 2 shoulder-width handles were built into the slab. He gripped them tightly. "How heavy is it?" Ken asked from beneath the slab. "Currently its baseline, a ton," Batman answered casually. "If you can't lift it, there are safeties, it can't crush you," the man reassured as he continued typing on the machine's computer. "A ton?" Ken asked in shock. There was no way he could lift a whole ton. He was about to get out from under the massive slab of metal when Batman spoke. "You can," the man said simply. Ken paused, thinking back to him kicking a moving van across the street and onto its side. Thinking back to when he jumped up multiple stories, like a superhero. He shook his head, pushing his hair out from his face. He got back under the weight, his hands gripping tightly around the metallic handles. "Twist the handles to release and activate the safety," Batman advised. He let out a sharp breath. And then he twisted and pressed. The weight moved with him. It wasn't easy, but it wasn't hard as he dropped the weight down, gently tapping against his chest as his arms then snapped up, sending the weight back to the sky. Ken snapped the handles back into place, the safety locking as he grinned. He just lifted a ton. Exhilaration filled him, but didn't stay as Batman spoke up once more. 2 tons, Batman said, a glint of fascination in his eyes as he watched the boy push the weight upwards, drop it slowly against his chest and press it upwards again. 3 tons, Batman adjusted the weight again. This time Ken struggled, his face going red as the weight pressed hard onto his chest, he pushed up and let out a groan as the weight slowly lifted up above his head. Batman nodded, writing notes down. "We'll move to the deadlift," the man said as they moved over towards a bar. Attached to the sides of it were two massive plates of metal, once again attached to a large machine on the roof above. 5 tons. Ken stood in front of the bar, bent down and kept his spine straight as he lifted with a grunt. The weight slowly, but lifting as Ken came to a full stand. Ken held the position for a few seconds before dropping the bar with a sharp exhale. Ken let out a long-drawn breath as he dropped his head back, his body burning. But it was a good burn, like he was finally doing something worthwhile with his body. Bruce looked down onto the machine's computer. It tracked the lifter's movement, form, potential for strength, even heartbeat. Which is what caught his eye. Ken's heartbeat was calm, settled. Predatory conditioning. Again, Batman said, his eyes locked onto the machine. Ken bent down to pick up the bar again. It came up even faster this time. 9 comments 0 vote. Phone calls and tears. Batman, these samples are extraordinary, Silas Stone said through the video call as he adjusted his glasses. I've never seen anything like these RC cells before. They're not viral or parasitic, they're integrated, completely systemic. Can it be reversed? Batman asked bluntly. Silas blinked. Reversed. His fingers paused over the keyboard. You're asking the wrong question. Batman's expression didn't change. He's a cannibal, Silas. He can't process any other food. Silas exhaled slowly, as if he already knew. That's not a malfunction, he said carefully. That's a specialization. Bruce's jaw tightened. Silas pulled up a scan and zoomed in on one of the 3 mystery organs in the boy's body, sharing his screen with the hero. See this, it generates and stores the RC cells. Silas explained. I've codenamed it a kakaho, but those RC cells cannot be generated by its body alone. What do you mean? Batman asked. The cells can only be generated after consuming human flesh. Silas explained. But his physiology runs off of these RC cells. His entire body has changed so that it can turn human flesh into fuel. Silas zoomed into another one of the organs lining the scan. If the cells get too low, I suspect he will die, but not before his body is put into survival mode. Bruce sighed, his finger gently tapping against his dashboard. He knew exactly what survival mode looked like as he recalled yesterday, Ken's red and black eyes staring hungrily at him. What about curing him, Silas? Is there any feasible way? Batman asked. Silas shook his head. Not unless you change every single cell in his body, it's not possible. Silas explained. You can suppress symptoms, even suppress the intake of flesh, but this isn't an illness to cure. Silas leaned back slowly, his eyes taking in the scans and sample results. Batman didn't move, didn't say a word. Whoever did this wasn't experimenting randomly, this is structured, planned. Silas explained. I just can't believe they perfected it so quickly. Bruce walked towards the gym. He could hear the weights locking in and out of safety. He knew exactly where Ken was. He was still in his suit and cowl, cape snapping behind him. He was hoping he would be able to cure the boy, send him on his way, maybe take him in as a Robin. Bruce shook his head, thinking back to Jason. He couldn't do that again. He let out a short controlled exhale, before opening the door to the specialized gym equipment. Ken was on the bench, quite easily repping almost 3 tons of weight. His form was okay, his elbows tucked as the weight slowly tapped his chest before he pushed upwards explosively. The weight dropped again before exploding up. Bruce didn't really know what to do. Did he have to tell the boy there was no cure? That he was stuck in the body of a cannibal for the rest of his life? Bruce waited until the set was over before speaking, his eyes sticking onto Ken's shaking arms as the weight slowly lifted once more. Ken got out from the metal slab, his eyes locking onto the tall man as red tinted his cheeks. Sorry if I'm not supposed to be here, it's just Alfred said. You can be in here. Batman interrupted. You've got good form, have you trained before? Ken nodded. Only sometimes, at the school gym, but it wasn't anything serious. Batman was only reminded that the boy was now out of school, homeless, having just lost his mother in such a brutal way, and about to be told he was forever in a body he hated. The body that laboratory gave him. Bruce hated himself just a bit more at his failure. He should have found the lab before it could ever have found a single victim. Ken's fingers gently tapped against the bench beneath him at the continued silence. He was about to speak, when Batman began. Bruce didn't soften it. There isn't a way to cure you. Silence. Ken's lips pursed together, his tongue running across the roof of his mouth as his fingers tapped faster against the bench beneath him. Bruce said nothing. "So I'm stuck like this?" Ken asked, nodding his head slowly as if he knew it the whole time. Batman nodded. A thick silence filled the gym, Ken's fists clenched as he thought back to his mother, the laboratory, and everything that happened since. Ken nodded again, his lips trembling as he swung himself back underneath the weight. His shaking hands tightening around the handles as he let out a trembling breath. He needed to do something. He twisted, letting the weight free of its safety. The weight trembled above him. Bruce took a few steps forward, close enough to spot. The weight dipped shakily to Ken's chest before it shot back upwards. "Control," Bruce said quietly. Ken exhaled sharply and steadied the weight above him before bringing it back down to his chest. Bruce watched carefully as the weight steadied. Ken just hoped that the man wasn't close enough to see the building tears in his eyes. 11 comments 0 vote. Bruce's decision. Ken had eaten earlier, the tasteless meat satiating but not satisfying him in the slightest. He hadn't slept, he was in a large guest room within the cave. He was honestly surprised that the cave seemed to have everything. He could hear someone in the cave, most likely Batman, going by how heavy the footsteps sounded. His senses were so highly attuned now, it was easy to focus on them while he was in the solitary cave, as opposed to the loud city of Gotham. He sat up, muscles tensing as he then stood. He needed to do something. Anything other than wallowing or laying in bed thinking about cures that weren't possible. He opened the door, making his way towards the gym. It was the only place he felt any sort of meaning. His mother died while he was being experimented on and given this body. He was being fueled by his mother's dead body. The least he could do was use it to its full extent. "Ken," the Batman said, Ken's head snapping in the man's direction in shock. When did he get here? Sometimes Ken just lost track of the man, sometimes his footsteps would be loud and then the next moment, they would be completely silent. Even to him. "Come with me," the man said as he turned away from the gym, and walked past the van-sized coin. Ken followed, his eyebrows furrowing as Batman led him to another section of the gargantuan cave. They came into a wide, gigantic hall, the walls lined with hand-to-hand weapons. Another section was filled with human dummies while the last section was filled with used, worn targets. In the very center of the room was a wrestling ring painted onto the ground below, meant for sparring. It must be one of Batman's training rooms, Ken thought, though he wondered if any of the famous Robins ever trained in here. He was always a big fan of the first Robin, now Nightwing. And everyone in Gotham knew what happened to the second Robin. "The Joker. Hit that dummy as hard as you can," Batman said as he pointed to the closest dummy, worn and used. Ken nodded. It must be built to take hits from enhanced people. He drew his clenched fist back, and with a twitch of his muscle fibers he sent it tearing towards the dummy. Crunch. The dummy snapped in half at the punch, its body falling apart as its chest snapped back, colliding with the other dummies in the room. "They're built with the same integrity as the human body," Batman revealed, as he took a step closer to Ken. "That's what would happen if you punched a real man." Ken's wide eyes spread through the room, debris covering the ground. He knew he was strong but hadn't imagined it quite like this. "We need to teach you control," the man said as he gestured to a different dummy. "Hit that one lightly, and work your way up until you barely dent it." So Ken followed the man's orders, starting incredibly light and working his way up. As he was doing that, Batman spoke. "Do you have any other family?" the man asked, his eyes locked onto Ken as the boy punched the dummy, barely knocking its head back. Ken shook his head. "Both of my parents were only children, so no aunts or uncles, and then my grandparents died before I was born," he said. "What about your father?" Batman asked. They both already knew the fate of Ken's mother. "Well, my dad's dead, died when I was young," Ken answered casually as his fist snapped out again, "and then it just left me and my mum, then she got sick." "What did she have?" "I could never pronounce it," Ken said with a shrug, fond memories playing through his mind of his mother. "But I can spell it perfectly, needed to, otherwise any unemployment and disability forms would just be sent right back." Batman nodded. He knew how hard it was to get forms like that sent and approved within a timely manner. Multiple of his charities had pushed Gotham City Council for better due process. Yet they got nothing, not yet. Batman watched the boy punch. He didn't have great form, but he could teach that after. Bruce let out a slow exhale. He couldn't think like that, as if Ken was a Robin. But Bruce also couldn't help thinking that way. The facts were that the boy had no family. had been kicked out of school, and if he ever showed up again in the public eye he would be questioned endlessly about his own mother's suspicious death. But if the boy was adopted by Bruce Wayne, any real questioning would go away. He would just be seen as the newest addition to the Wayne family. But if he didn't train Ken, who knows how his power would be used? It's not like Bruce could keep him locked away for his entire life. The boy was strong enough to throw a truck, and could likely run just as fast as a car. Bruce imagined another supervillain running around Gotham and already felt tired. Bruce had decided what he was going to do. Ken. The boy turned his head towards the man as he stopped punching, his control already miles better. Batman stepped closer, lifting his hands up to his chin in a typical boxer's guard. Punch like this. Bruce demonstrated a slow, precise punch, his torso twisting as his fist outstretched with perfect form. Ken nodded, watching carefully as he mimicked the movement, his fist slamming outwards into the dummy with a soft crack. When you're using your whole body, it'll be stronger, Batman advised. So be careful, slow it down. Ken nodded, adjusting and swinging again. This time it was too weak. Batman nodded. Perfect form, this time just go a tiny bit faster. From the entrance to the hall Alfred watched the duo, a small smile pulling gently at his lips at the sight as the sound of gentle thuds and subsequent corrections filled the lonely hall. 13 comments 0 vote. The manor upstairs. Ken groaned as he pushed hard, his fists clenching hard around the handles as the weight slowly lifted. His arms locked out and he twisted the safety with a sharp exhale. He sat up, hunching forward as he breathed heavily, sweat beaded his forehead as music played through the gym. It had been almost an entire week since Ken first arrived in the Batcave. Batman was watching from the side, his eyes on the form. Well done, Ken, the masked man said, his eyes on the weight. 3.5 tons. Ken was progressing quickly, his deadlift had already soared to 6 tons. His body was clearly getting used to actually pushing itself. Batman looked over at the boy. He was calm, seemed to be getting into a routine. He would wake up, eat, train more and then sleep. But he seemed to enjoy training, enjoying pushing himself beyond his limitations. He especially enjoyed combat training. Bruce had struggled for the first couple days. With Dick and Jason, it was easy to get them to learn the rigid basics and then they learned the flashy kicks, flips and sweeps. With Ken it was different. It was difficult to teach him the rigid basics. He knew how to throw a punch, knew the proper form, but when they sparred it's like the boy forgot all of it. But as Bruce watched through recordings of the fights, he quickly picked up the issue. Ghouls had their own sense of combat, instincts of how they shouldn't fight. Then he realized Ken was already built in with all of his basics. So Bruce switched the training, playing into the ghoul's strengths. So he didn't make Ken fight like a human, he let the boy fight like a ghoul, but he punished the mistakes he made harshly. But one thing Bruce had noticed was the fact Ken never overextended, never got into a position where there wasn't a way out. But what was curious about that was that Ken could afford to overextend, he could afford to exchange blows with almost any human alive. It only had one real explanation to Bruce, and that was that the instincts of a ghoul were hardwired to fight other ghouls. Similar to a male lion, it didn't grow a mane for hunting. It grew it for the other lion's teeth. Ken was watching Batman on the large computer. The man was searching for a lead in the case of a new serial killer in Gotham. Bruce was tracking all known kills, but they were randomly scattered throughout Gotham. He checked population statistics, checked the races, genders of the victims, but the killer seemed completely random in their choice. Bruce pulled up a picture of the victim's body, a gaping hole in the man's neck from what looked to be a knife. The man's body was placed carefully onto his own dining table. "What do you think?" the man in the cowl said bluntly. Ken didn't blink at the gore, he only leaned forward as he assessed the image. "It looks ritualistic," Ken said, eyeing the body placed carefully onto the dining table. "Looks like the victim didn't struggle, maybe he trusted the killer." Bruce nodded. "What makes you say that?" "The hands, and the wound." Ken answered. "I feel like I'd at least put my hands up, try and block any weapon, and the wound looks too clean, not like the guy even had a chance to move." Bruce nodded. "Good, that's what I saw, but the killer couldn't have reasonably stabbed the man from behind because of the angle of the wound." Bruce said, thinking aloud. "The killer may be a meta." A loud ringing cut Batman off as a picture of Nightwing covered the screen. Nightwing was video calling Batman. Ken looked up with wide eyes, as Batman casually answered, speaking first. "Nightwing, the man said, cutting off Nightwing before he could even begin to speak. Nightwing was wearing his iconic suit and mask, looking perturbed as Batman cut him off. "Hey, what's up, Bridge?" Nightwing paused, narrowing his eyes at the phone in confusion. "Who's that?" Batman nodded towards Ken. "Ken." Nightwing seemed stunned. "Seriously, Bruce," the man said, his tone changing for the worse. Ken looked over at the man awkwardly while also processing the new information. His name was Bruce. "Nightwing, Batman," now Bruce said sternly. "He needs help." Nightwing shook his head. "You said you were done, Bruce." A dull static echoed through the cave as Bruce's jaw tightened. But his voice stayed controlled as he spoke to the vigilante. "This is different." Nightwing shook his head. "You said that last time, Bruce." The vigilante sounded bitter. Ken looked between the screen and Batman, the tension filling the room. "He's not a Robin, Dick." Ken furrowed his brows. "That was rude." "Not yet," Nightwing said as he shook his head in disbelief. The call ended. Silence hung heavy in the cave. Ken looked at the Bat computer screen, back to the victim's corpse before he turned to the man beside him. "Bruce?" he asked, the name feeling weird, alien on his tongue. Batman didn't seem like he was even human at times, never mind a human with a real human name. The man didn't answer, deciding only to take off his gloves, to reveal pale hands that reached up to the cowl and pulled it back, revealing his face to Ken for the first time. He had dark hair that hung across his pale forehead, bright sharp blue eyes that were as sharp as the batarangs on his belt. A very familiar face. "Holy shit," Ken whispered, his wide eyes fixed onto the man's face. "You're Bruce Wayne." The man nodded as he looked Ken in the eyes, probably the first time Ken's really looked him in the eyes and not the white lenses. "Yes." Ken stared at him, trying to reconcile it with the man he heard about online, the one he met at the homeless shelter. "I met you at the homeless shelter," Ken said in shock, his eyes wide and jaw slack. Bruce nodded. "I had found out there was a cannibal in Gotham. I tracked it down to you, found out it wasn't something you could control." Ken snorted, shaking his head in shock before speaking up again. Wait." He stopped, recalibrating as the shock started to settle. "You're a billionaire." "Yes." Ken blinked. "And you live down here." For the first time that night, maybe ever, something like amusement flickered over Bruce Wayne's face. "It's efficient." Ken shook his head, a smirk pulling at his lips. "Can you buy me a house?" he asked cheekily. "No," Bruce said, the amusement still present. "But you can come and see the one upstairs." Ken's eyes slowly dragged up to the roof, a realization coming to him. "Is Wayne Manor up there?" he asked, his finger pointing to the roof of the cave. Bruce nodded. "How big is it?" the teenager asked excitedly. "Pretty big," Bruce responded. Ken burst to his feet. He'd always wanted to see a mansion. 18 comments 0 vote. Robin. Ken woke up in a giant bedroom, fancy decor lining the cream walls. The bed alone was bigger than Ken's old bedroom, large curtains spilling over the sides like a princess's bed from the movies. Ken yawned as he sat up, the sun shining through lavish bright curtains onto the rich expensive carpet below. Ken stepped out onto the soft carpet, stretching like a cat. He wiped his eyes, glancing towards the large ensuite in the corner of the room. Intricate furniture lining the bedroom. It was all so alien to him. Even just the sheets likely cost more than his mother's old monthly rent. He wished his mother could be here, somewhere safe, somewhere warm. He looked towards the large door leading to the sweeping hallways of Wayne Manor and could only feel a deep sense of anticipation. In the cave, he had no expectations put onto him. He was just like one of the countless bats hidden in the shadows. Now though, it was different. He took a deep breath and opened the cold door handle with a click. He stepped out into the hallway, closing the door with a click behind him. He looked both left and right, the hallway stretching out almost endlessly. He'd forgotten which direction to take to get back to the dining room. He tilted his head, sharpening his hearing. He could hear footsteps far away, to the right. He followed. Eventually he got to the large dining room, on the ground floor, close to the main entrance of the manor and a great twirling staircase that reached up sky high. He walked into the fancy room, family portraits lining the walls. Bruce and Alfred sat at the end of the large mahogany table eating together. Alfred saw him first, the man giving him a kind smile and gesturing towards a plate filled with steaming food. "Master Ken, I've cooked something up for you, using your food." "Your food" was just a nice way to say artificial human meat. Bruce gave him a nod, as the man ate politely. Ken approached, sat next to the kind elderly butler as he pulled the plate towards himself. He'd never had it cooked before, he just hoped it didn't taste like any of the other cooked food he'd tried as a ghoul. He used his hands, skipping the fork as he pulled the seared meat to his nose and sniffed and then took a curious bite. The texture was different, definitely better, but the taste was still the same, if not worse. Regardless, he chewed and swallowed while giving Alfred a thumbs up with his other hand in thanks. The man only smiled and nodded. The breakfast continued in a comfortable silence. As Ken continued eating his food, he couldn't help but feel sick. Still, he finished it, doing his best to ignore memories of warm, succulent blood and tender raw flesh. Ken eyed a newspaper laid on a cabinet in the main entrance. He eyed the article name, curiosity brimming as he picked it up. Batman stops thugs in bank heist. Ken's brows furrowed. When did the dark-haired man even have time for that? This was late last night, the newspaper published in the early morning. Bruce didn't even seem tired. The photo in the newspaper was grainy, clearly not taken by a professional. You could see the distant silhouette of the Batman atop a roof, zip-tied thugs left outside the steps of the bank. Ken thought back to his strength, his power, and then he thought about his current routine. He trained, ate and slept. He had no meaning, nothing other than constant hunger. He needed something, anything other than the constant fear that he would snap. Even after just eating the fake meat, he still felt hungry. The artificial meat sat heavy in his stomach, but it didn't touch the deeper craving. The ones that whispered. He shook his head, dislodging thoughts of blood and bone. Focused back onto the newspaper. He looked down at his own hands, strong enough to destroy steel. To destroy people, and what did he use them for? He turned, heading towards the large grandfather clock that hid the entrance to the Batcave. He pulled a hidden lever, the clock shifting to the side. He needed purpose, direction. The cave was just as he remembered. Of course it wouldn't have changed overnight, but it was still a comforting thought as he walked past the large bat computer. It had 4 separate passwords with 2 different biometric scans and hidden traps all entangled into it. Bruce wasn't careless. Ken didn't even try. Instead, the ghoul walked towards the training room he and Bruce regularly sparred in. The man recorded each and every spar so he could watch and analyze them. He walked towards the heavy-duty laptop left on a table filled with equipment, opened it up. His file was already open. Dozens of clips. He clicked on one and pressed play. The footage was from one of his spars yesterday. It showed him and Bruce facing each other. The older man stepped forward looking grounded, centered. Ken didn't. Instead of stepping forward, Ken vanished. One foot bounced off of a wall. Then the ceiling beam. Then suddenly he was behind Bruce. The older man had already begun to pivot, predicting Ken's move as a blunted batarang flew out towards the ghoul that disappeared once again. Ken switched to a different clip. This time it wasn't him. It was a boy, younger than Ken, with dark hair and pale skin. He looked a lot like Bruce. He had a small frame, an aggressive but excited grin on his face as he recklessly lunged at Bruce. Bruce countered gently, knocking the young boy to the ground. The boy only grinned, pushing himself back to his feet with an annoyed yell. Then he got knocked back down. And got up, again and again. Ken leaned closer. Was this a young Nightwing? The boy got a clean blow onto Bruce's abdomen, laughing excitedly before being knocked back down to the ground. The boy groaned in annoyance, pulling an indignant face up at the black-haired man. Bruce laughed. Ken had never seen the man laugh, even smile. He scrubbed forward through the footage. It became more intense. The boy grew, got stronger, faster, angrier. And then, nothing. The video stopped. Ken felt as if the cave just got colder, his eyes lingering on the last shot the file gave him. A shot of the teenager, giving Bruce an annoyed look as he walked off, clearly disgruntled. He wondered. Hey, an unfamiliar voice rang out, Ken snapping his head towards the source in shock. You're Ken, right? A man, young but older than Ken, stood at the entrance to the gym. He had black hair and blue eyes, just like Bruce, but his build was slimmer, his hair messy and casual. Yeah, Ken answered awkwardly as he turned towards the man as suddenly Ken felt wrong, as if he was out of place. As if he never really belonged here. My name's Dick, the man said easily with a smile as he casually scratched the back of his head. His eyes flicked to the laptop screen. He didn't smile this time. You found Jason. Ken didn't answer. Dick stepped further into the room, hands sliding down into his pockets as he looked around nostalgically. He used to hog this room, always saying Bruce pulled his punches with me, never him. Dick revealed. Then seconds later he'd complain about Bruce not taking him seriously and being soft. Dick sighed, though shook his head fondly as a smile ghosted over his face, but it didn't really reach his eyes. Ken glanced back to the image frozen on the laptop. Jason. To be continued. Thank you for watching.